Good afternoon YouTube, it's Tony the Lakeland Biker. Me and Fiona have just been for a coffee in Keswick and filled the bike tanks up. And Mrs May's called another election. Now, although she claims it's got nothing to do with Brexit, personally I think that the reason why is because she wants a firm electoral platform to stand on in the EU negotiation. And this morning I wrote to President Juncker, as a pro-European Brit, expressing my disbelief at the behaviour of the EU and the fact that the EU seem to have seriously miscalculated when it comes to the British attitude to the EU. Now, to wind the clock back 16 months, in early 2016 David Cameron went to Brussels to see if he could renegotiate parts of the British deal with the EU, because he needed a positive argument to fight the referendum on. Now, I think making the referendum was a mistake, and I'm sure he never thought he would lose. But the EU weren't prepared to play ball with him. They basically offered him nothing, which provided the likes of Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage with all the argument to say, with the arguments where they could say that the EU will not negotiate. So basically they played into the Brexiteers' point of view. If I didn't know better, I would have said that the EU didn't want the British anymore. So we had the referendum last year and Britain voted by a very narrow majority. I believe it was about 750,000 people, about 750,000 people out of 50 million, 62 million, to leave. So it wasn't a solid mandate they had by any stretch of the imagination. And then the EU basically said, we'll negotiate in fairness, yet everything which has come out of the EU since has actually sounded very, very dictatorial. Now, I'm a pro-European, and as I said, I wrote to President Juncker this morning expressing my disbelief in the Europeans' attitude. I pointed out that we Britons have a very, very simple premise, and it's one thing which, regardless of political affiliation, we all believe in, and that's that principle of fairness. We don't like things to be unfair. And it seems to me that the EU aren't prepared to be fair. I might say I'm a pro-European, and I find the attitude of the EU quite despicable at the moment. We had that whole thing about Spain and Gibraltar. We've got the business of Mr Juncker's office leaking the meeting in what was very, very petty terms about his meeting with Theresa May last month. You know, the comments which were coming out were little short of bullying, and it's not a good idea to bully the British, because we're stubborn and we will dig our heels in on a point of principle. Then you had Mrs Merkel basically saying the UK have no share of the EU's assets, yet we've been the second biggest contributor to the EU. Now, even the very, very pro-federal European leader of the European Greens grouping has turned around and said, you know, the EU is shooting themselves in the foot with comments like that. So for a pro-federal European like him to be coming round and having a go at them on that indicates the EU aren't being particularly fair. Now, As I said earlier, Mrs May does not have a consensus. She has a majority, but she doesn't have a consensus. And if the EU carry on with the behaviour they've got, without reining in the likes of Verhofstadt and others I could mention, Mr Macron, for instance, the new president of France, really has shot the EU in the foot over the Brexit negotiation, I believe, because they're just reinforcing that opinion of the British that you can't trust the EU. Now, I believe passionately that the EU has been a force for good. Yes, it has its problems. Yes, it's got its issues. Yes, it has its problems with the democratic deficit within the system. Yes, you can turn round and say that in one respect the EU is quite fascistic, because regardless of how you vote in an EU election, you cannot change the political direction of the organisation. And if the ballot box cannot effect change, then in all honesty it's not actually a democratic process. But all that aside, I still believe that the EU is a force for good. But even I am starting to turn round and think, well, am I right to support this institution in the way it's behaving? Because it isn't behaving like a grown-up rational body, it is behaving like a spurned spouse. I'm not giving you the house. I'm not giving you the house. That's the impression which is being applied to the EU by the British press. And surely the people who are dealing with the EU negotiation are grown-up people who are supposedly professional politicians. They should know how to mind their P's and Q's publicly. But they don't seem to be able to. And they're just giving ammunition to the likes of Rupert Murdoch and that extreme right-wing press, driving the British people to a more and more pro-Brexit stance. And this is, you know, this is coming from a pro-European. You know, yes, I've mentioned that I've got my issues with the EU, and I recognise its faults quite openly. But as I said, I believe passionately that it is a force for good. And then you have little Europeans running around saying, oh, well, the British have never been interested in Europe. Well, might I suggest to those people, go and have a look at the graveyards in Normandy and in Flanders. The fact that we threw away the combined wealth of 200 years of the most successful empire the earth has ever seen in fighting wars for European freedom. Now, I'm not saying that should be taken into account in the Brexit negotiation. What I am saying is you should always consider that element of the British character. The fact that we nationally do have a habit of standing up and putting our, basically our vote, and you know, putting ourselves where our mouth is. And the EU clearly didn't believe that. And I think they're still struggling to comprehend that we want to leave the EU. I think they find it very, very difficult to understand. But unless they start opening their eyes and smelling the flowers, any chance of a sensibly negotiated exit is going to be sunk before it starts, because Theresa May will walk away from the EU without a deal. When she says Brexit means Brexit, she is a sort of stubborn person, and in that respect she is very, very typical of the British, who will stick to that. It might hurt us, but we don't mind being hurt if it's on a point of principle. And I think Mr. Juncker and Mr. Tusk and Mr Verhofstadt aren't considering that element of our national character in these debates. And if they carry on the way they are, we will leave the EU without a deal. And that's going to be harmful for the United Kingdom, but it's also going to be harmful for the Europeans, because they are losing the kudos of being able to have the Union flag hanging behind them. Now, we're not a world superpower anymore. I accept that. But we are a nation which has a much bigger international, what's the word am I looking for? Internationally perceived position than we probably have, than we probably deserve. And the EU is losing a lot of kudos without the UK, and if they carry on the way they're going, the idea of having the UK as a solid economic and political partner is becoming less and less. And being perfectly honest with you, the way they're carrying on at the moment, the decades following Britain leaving the EU could be a situation of no cooperation at all between Britain and mainland Europe, and that will be harmful for the EU, not only because of Britain's military proficiency, but also because we are very, very good at finding consensus. It's one of the things we're actually very good at. Yes, we can be stubborn, yes, we can be pig ignorant, yes, we can be arrogant, but at the end of the day, we're generally always fair. And I don't think the EU quite recognise that. Anyway, I've completely and utterly bollocks this up, so I'll leave it there for now. Toodaloo.